Okay, so in the Prima Secundae, which is Thomas's fundamental moral theology, you could say, the basic principles of moral theology, the longest single section is on emotions, passiones animae, and it's one of the longest sections in the whole Summa, longer than the section on the Blessed Trinity, longer than the section on the Holy Eucharist. So it's quite, that's a remarkable fact to begin with. A second one is, I'm not aware of anything comparable before, during, or after the life of Aquinas. And even though people say, obviously Aquinas was very influential in his philosophical theology and his dogmatic theology, he wasn't nearly as influential in his moral theology. In other words, it didn't find its way into the general understanding and approach of the Church in regard to how moral theology should be done. Leonard Boyle, who was a very, very remarkable Irish Dominican medievalist, did a survey of the reproduction of the manuscripts of the Summa in the first 100 years or 200 years to see which parts of the Summa were most in demand, from the number of manuscripts that survive. So which part do you think was the most popular in the Summa? You know, the Prima Pars, creation and God and the human being, the Prima Secundae, fundamental moral theology, Secunda Secundae, the virtues in particular, gifts, and the Tertia Pars, Christology and the sacraments.
Was it the first part of the second part?
No, it was the second part of the second part. So the demand, because Dominicans, like other preachers and priests, are busy men, and they don't always have time for metaphysics and philosophical theology, and even sacramental theology, but they do have need for material for pastoral care and preaching. And the Secunda Secundae was a rich quarry, because it's about practical things, about virtues, human situations, relationships, and so on. So that's the one that was copied most. Then I can't remember offhand which between the other three, the Tertia Pars, the Prima Secundae, and the Prima Pars, which were copied. I can check. It's in a little article by Leonard Boyle called "The Setting of the Summa," which you may know, but which is a kind of a basic text, I think, for knowing about the Summa and Aquinas' project in the Summa, which he says was basically a project of moral theology, that the point of the whole Summa is to offer a new approach to moral theology. But it wasn't taken up. When you look at what happened to moral theology in subsequent centuries, you don't find Aquinas' approach carrying as much weight as the approach based on the commandments, for example, or later on the distinction between law and conscience, which became the kind of the basic pattern in which to think about moral questions, law as an external norm and conscience as an internal norm, etc., etc. And the Jesuits and the Redemptorists and the moral theological schools, in which there were Dominicans too, but the Dominicans involved in that were accepting the terms in which it was set up by the modern moral theologians, Jesuits and Redemptorists particularly. So I would say Aquinas' moral, the Summa was a failure then in that sense. If Aquinas set out, he came to Santa Sabina, he spent 2 years at Santa Sabina planning the Summa, beginning to write the Prima Pars. He had according to Leonard Boyle, his project was to offer the generality of the Dominicans in formation a new approach to moral theology, which would keep it firmly set within a dogmatic theology and a theology of the Church and the sacraments. Then the evidence seems to be that he didn't quite succeed in communicating his point, because people said, oh yeah, it's all very well, the prima pars and the tertia pars, but really we need the secunda secundae to get to the practical stuff. So that's all just as a way of saying the things we find in Aquinas' moral theology, don't forget that they did not become that influential in the Church's general approach to moral theology subsequently. And certainly this long treatment of human emotions, now you may know other texts similar to this, but I can't think of anybody who did anything comparable, any moral philosopher, moral theologian. When you get to maybe the 17th century, you'll have people beginning to write, moralists and writers of stories and so on, who begin to prepare the way for novels and literature, which is a place where this kind of material is treated more than in theology textbooks. Fergus Kerr, that's another name you probably know. Fergus Kerr is still alive, thank God, is 89. Fergus said to me one time, he said, oh my God, he said, I had to go to these meetings of moral theologians, and you were supposed to know everything about fallopian tubes. And eventually I said, we'd all be better off reading Shakespeare. And I read something by Trevor Nunn. Trevor Nunn is maybe not a name you know, but Trevor Nunn is very famous. Sir Trevor Nunn is a very famous theatre producer, of plays and so on in London. And I was reading something by him the other day, and he says he's found all his teaching, all the teaching he needed about human life, about virtue, about vice, about relationships in the plays of Shakespeare. And he says, as far as he knows, there's far more there than in any religious textbook. So that's Trevor Nunn. But Fergus had made this comment many years before. We'd all be better off reading Shakespeare. And I remember, being at Othello, at a performance of Othello in London, and it is quite remarkable, the analysis of virtue and vice and conscience and freedom and emotion and decision in those plays of Shakespeare. So, but I think it's there in another form in the Summa of Aquinas, that I think he has this knowledge and wisdom about human life and relationships, and it's presented in a way that's obviously not as interesting immediately as a drama on the stage, but the content is very interesting. So that's the first point I'd like to stress, that here's a treatment of human emotion, of feelings, passions, in Aquinas, who's renowned for many high theological endeavors, and he gives this time and energy to this ordinary reality of feelings. Now it's not as if all of this is original with Aquinas. As I said at the beginning this morning, part of his genius for me is his ability to glean, to gather in the wisdom of the ages, to bring into focus what he finds in Plotinus or Boetius or Augustine or the Bible or the Stoics, and to mold it all into a comprehensive presentation. And that's certainly true of this section, that he gathers in everything he can find in the earlier traditions and summarizes it in the form of this table which I've given you there. A classification of the emotions. Passiones is his word in Latin. The passions, which he divides into two basic types, what he calls concupiscible and irascible, following Aristotle. And the distinction between these two is emotions which are straightforward desire, if you like, and emotion which is desire, but to which some difficulty is attached. So the concupiscible emotions are the straightforward desires. And he says if it's a good object, your initial inclination is called love, your initial attraction to that object. Then desire is the word for moving out of yourself towards it, and joy or delight is when you manage to lay hold on that bar of chocolate. The evil object then has corresponding reactions, provokes corresponding reactions, an initial hatred, an aversion or an attempt to avoid it, and a sadness if you fail to avoid it, if it comes on you in spite of your efforts to avoid it. The irascible or assertive emotions, contending emotions is another translation. As I say, they're desires, they're feelings in relation to things in the world, which are good or bad, presenting themselves to us as good or bad. And in this case, there's some difficulty attached to possessing the good or avoiding the bad, more difficulty than in the simple case. So for a good object, for which there's some difficulty attached in attaining it, there is hope, the feeling of hope that you might get it, and there's the feeling of despair when it becomes clear that you're not going to get it. For the evil object, there's the feeling of fear at the approach of this evil object. There's the feeling of daring, what he calls daring or boldness, which is to try to take it on. And there's the feeling of anger, ira, which gives its name to these feelings, irascible, which is a very peculiar emotion in Aquinas, anger, because that's why I put it in a little category by itself. It's difficult to say, is it for the good? Is it about good? Is it about evil? It seems to be about both. No. A typical case for Aquinas is injustice, is what provokes anger. You get angry when you find yourself facing a situation which you see to be unjust. And it's the healthy response to an unjust situation. That's a good point to make, actually, that these are all healthy feelings for Aquinas. These are all responses of the healthy organism to the circumstances that are described. So if you find yourself, presented with a good which is desirable, you ought to respond like that. If you find yourself presented with an evil which is to be avoided, you ought to respond like that. If you find yourself in a room with a bear, then and you're not afraid, then either the bear is dead or there's something wrong with your emotional life. No? So these are all healthy. That's the point. It's not that some are morally good and some are morally bad. They're all healthy responses of the human person to different situations. They become morally significant, but for them to have moral significance, you have to step back or step up, we might say, and bring in reason, bring in thought and reason and judgment, and then if the emotion is attached to an action which is morally wrong, if it's in support of an action which is morally wrong, then it's morally wrong. So that's where it gets its morality from, not from the feeling itself, but from its place in the bigger human picture. Okay. I gave a series one time years ago, 8 talks, on that table. So there's not going to be time to go into that. It's a whole section that you could spend a lot of time looking at, and again, it's quite analytical in the way that Aquinas does it. It's quite rich. Many of the bits of wisdom that are handed down from earlier thinkers are included. Famously, things like the solution for depression, therapies for depression, a hot bath, a glass of wine, a conversation with a friend. He never recommended the three at the same time, but but these are that's a rude thing to say, isn't it? There's a passage where he recommends these therapies for depression. So. But there are many, many interesting things in that whole section. I've added a few quotations which we can talk about, which bring out some points. Am I responsible for my feelings, or are they completely involuntary? Aristotle, first of all. And this is a very interesting text from Aristotle. I believe it to be an error to say that acts occasioned by anger or desire are involuntary. I'm not responsible for it, I was angry. I'm not responsible for it, I was full of desire. I was overtaken by desire. You won't get very far with that as a defense. Why? Aristotle says, no, you can't say that acts occasioned by strong feelings are involuntary. For in the first place, if we maintain this, we shall have to give up the view that any of the lower animals, or even children, are capable of voluntary action. And he thinks they are capable of voluntary action. No? So that's interesting. There's an example of how the classification is not absolutely separate. He thinks animals are capable of voluntary action. I saw a squirrel one day making a decision. I was coming along the... It was in London. I was coming along the path and there was a squirrel, and between me and the squirrel was a piece of food. And the squirrel stopped and it looked at me and it looked at the food and it made a decision, because it ran away. So two conflicting emotions or instincts in the animal. So it was, I suppose, voluntary in some way, a voluntary act of the squirrel. So. In the second place, when we act from desire or anger, are none of our actions voluntary? Or are our fine actions voluntary and our ignoble actions involuntary? It was a righteous anger in the cause of justice. It's an absurd distinction, Aristotle says, since the agent is one and the same person. You can't take the credit for it in one circumstance and avoid the blame for it in another circumstance if it's originating in the same way. It's surely paradoxical to describe as involuntary acts inspired by sentiments which we quite properly desire to have. These are sentiments we quite properly desire to have. So you can't say then that what you do on the back of that, with the strength of that, is not voluntary. There are some things at which we ought to feel angry and others which we ought to desire. Health, for instance, and the acquisition of knowledge. If we're not feeling the right feelings for certain things in life, then there's something wrong with our mechanism, with our organism, that we're not functioning properly if we don't feel the appropriate feelings in certain circumstances. Thirdly, people assume that what is involuntary must be painful, and what falls in with our own wishes must be pleasant. But he says that's not the basis for the distinction. Simply, is it painful or pleasant? That's not enough to indicate whether it's voluntary or involuntary. Fourthly, what difference is there in point of voluntariness between wrong actions which are calculated and wrong actions which are done on impulse? Both are to be avoided. And the further reflection suggests itself that the irrational emotions are no less typically human than our considered judgment. There's an interesting statement. The irrational emotions are no less typically human than our considered judgment. And that's what we've been looking for this morning, a kind of an anthropology which is open to the full truth about the human person. And irrational emotions, according to Aristotle, are no less typically human than are considered judgment. Whence it follows that actions inspired by anger or desire are equally typical of the human being who performs them. To classify these actions as involuntary, therefore, is surely a very strange proceeding. Okay, so it's always seemed to me that that's an important text from Aristotle for thinking about, am I responsible for my feelings? I'm responsible for what I do in relation to my feelings. Feelings come upon us. They're not things that we can, in an authoritarian way, decide we're going to feel. I can't say now at this moment, I'm gonna feel angry, and I can't do it. I can't imperate. I can't order myself into an emotion. So in one sense, they're outside of our control. That we find ourselves feeling different things, but they're always in relation to some. It's an engagement with the world. It's part of our engagement with the world. So they're always attendant on a bigger human situation. Even if I'm by myself in my room, my feelings might change, but my feelings will be changing in line with what I'm thinking about. Somebody just said something to me as I was leaving the refectory. I didn't realize till I got to my room what he'd actually said, and now I'm very troubled by so they're connected with a bigger human situation. But they come on us. They come attending some other bigger reality, some aspect of our relations, our activities. Aquinas makes a very good distinction between, he uses the terms antecedent passion and consequent passion. And a good example of it would be this: if I act out of anger, it's not so good. It's not so good as a human action. If I act with anger, where the situation justifies it, then it is a full human action. You see the distinction? And you know the distinction. When people are angry with you, you can tell the distinction between somebody acting towards you out of anger and somebody acting towards you with anger. And you're not demolished by the second one. You'll feel demolished by the first one. If somebody acts out of anger. If somebody acts with anger, it's reasonable. So the person will say, I'm very angry with you about this. And you can live with it in a way that it's not possible to live with somebody acting out of anger. You just have to go away and let them cool down. Wait till they see sense, see it better. But Aquinas uses that distinction, antecedent and consequent passion. And the antecedent is not so good. The consequent is more morally healthy, correct. Over the page we look at another text of Aquinas, which is very extraordinary about this. The little text at the end of the first page is about pleasure. This is Aristotle again. The moral nature of pleasure depends on the ethical quality of the activity of which it is the pleasure. The pleasure that perfects the activity or activities of the perfect and perfectly happy man is human in the full meaning of the word. So there is pleasure, delight, gaudium, attending all possession of the good, all enjoyment of the good will produce pleasure. And pleasure itself is, you can't make any judgment. Again, you can't make any judgment about the morality of pleasure until you know what is it the pleasure of. It is the pleasure of reading a wonderful poem, the pleasure of seeing somebody suffering, the pleasure of listening to music, the pleasure of a nice meal. It depends on what it's the pleasure of. But there is pleasure attending any possession of what we've judged to be good. Over the page is this from Aquinas, which again I've always thought is a very remarkable text, from the Questiones Disputate de Malo. Here's his anthropology again. Since human nature means being composed of soul and body, as well as of an intellectual and a sensual nature, soul, body, intellectual, sensual, the good of the human being requires that he be totally subject to virtue, namely in his intellectual part, and in his sensual part, and in his physical part. So right down to the body, not just to the feelings, which we might say is the sensual part, but to the body itself. So for human virtue, it is required that the desire for due retribution, this is what motivates anger, the desire for due retribution, to restore the order of justice. That's what's making you, that's what's got you going. You want to restore an order of justice. The desire for due retribution should be present not only in the rational part of the soul, like a Stoic, but also in the sensitive part and in the body itself, so that even the body is moved to serve virtue. So that's quite a powerful little text. In other words, to be a virtuous man, to be a virtuous human being, is to have the passion associated, and the passion and the pleasure associated with the good you are pursuing and the evil you're avoiding find its way even into your body. No? So. According to tradition, Thomas had a fairly substantial body supporting all these things, but I'm not sure about that. I think people said he was a big man, he was a great man, Thomas Aquinas, and then it became understood as he was physically substantial, but I don't know. Last one I've added is from Jordan of Saxony. Well, there's a surprising visitor to the house this morning. Again, it's a quotation I came across many years ago, and I've always valued it. This is from a letter which Jordan of Saxony wrote to the order in 1233. You find it in Simon Tugwell's volume, Early Dominicans. How often do the sordid, aimless meanderings of our affections lead us along crooked paths, not directed in the way of truth, and with no eye on our proper goal? Now, we may feel that Jordan is describing more accurately our own condition from day to day, and Thomas is describing things a little bit more idealistically. We say a lot, we do a lot, we endure a tremendous lot, which would make us so much richer in virtue, so much more fruitful in merit, if only charity abounded in our hearts, directing and ordering everything towards our proper goal, which is God. Charity. But as it is, our minds are too often occupied with futile thoughts, our feelings drawn by futile desires. We do not carry through to its end the sifting and purging of our heart's purposes. So it's hardly surprising that we're so slow to accomplish anything, so sluggish is our ascent towards perfection, maturity. So already 1233 is not long into the life of the order. The master of the order is obliged to write to the brethren and say, come on, let's pick ourselves up, let's do it a little bit more energetically, more effectively. But they're references to our affections, our life, our emotional life is present every day. We're always feeling something. There's no way around that unless we become numb in some ways to things. So it's healthy to have a flowing emotional life, but there are our thoughts, there are our memories, there are other people, there are the things we do, there are the ways in which our emotional life can be turbulent and distracted. There are the 7 deadly sins, another very interesting road we could go down, no? From the monastic tradition. The logismoi, they're called logismoi, fantasies, imaginations. Another thing that comes into us without our deciding to invite it in. We find ourselves paranoid, we find ourselves lustful, we find ourselves thinking proud thoughts, we find ourselves envious. What do we do? And they're thoughts, logismoi, Evagrius of Pontus, but they're feelings. They're very much connected with feelings as well, very closely connected with feelings. This is part of the emotional life that Jordan is talking about, the aimless meanderings of our affections along crooked paths. So keep our focus on God, charity as the thing which gathers in all of this human living. The phrase I put in italics is the one that appeals to me particularly. We do not carry through to its end the sifting and purging of our heart's purposes. It's a very good phrase, isn't it? And spiritual life, spiritual discipline, perseverance in meditation, spiritual direction, going to confession, these are all the ways, persevering in prayer. These are the ways in which we try to carry through to its end the sifting and purging of our heart's purposes. So I just put it there because I like that text a lot. But I think it also says something important about what we're talking about, which is this emotional level of human experience. Nicholas Lombardo, brother of the St. Joseph Province, published this book some years ago, The Logic of Desire, Aquinas on Emotion. As far as I know, it's the best current introduction to this section of the Summa. Good, not just because he knows St. Thomas very well, but because he also brings it into conversation with contemporary analytical philosophy and contemporary psychological understandings of emotions. So I think I'd recommend that there. Okay, now I have a third handout, but we'll keep it till tomorrow because there wouldn't be time now to get into it. It's too important. So we have some time for conversation if you want to chip in. Yeah, Damien.
I thought on the previous handout, the second axiom was particularly helpful for thinking about sort of some of the dynamics that go into our growth in this life and formation. I think of Timothy Radcliffe in something, I forget what it is, maybe it's his letter to people in formation. He talks about often the reasons we enter are not the reasons that we end up staying in the order. I think that goes along with this principle here that as we grow, as we mature in our formation, we start to sort of see what the purpose of this life is more clearly, hopefully, and hopefully that sort of purifies some of our motives, why we're here, what we're about. I think we all probably have when we enter a general idea. I mean, we know what the end of religious life is, what the goal is, but still there are a lot of other things that get mixed in there, and so sort of as we grow in the life, those things sort of some of those things fade away. The end gets more in focus. So I was really struck by that earlier, just thinking that that's a good thing to sort of think about in our formation. What are we? How is the shape that we're in basically affecting how we're looking at the goal of our life, and how that changes over time?
No, thank you for that. Yes, I agree. And then, it's one of the reasons why formation must be permanent, because the shape we're in changes not just during the years of initial formation, but as other things happen in the course of a life, the shape we're in changes. So the goal hopefully becomes simpler and clearer. Jordan says charity, is kind of saying direct, make that your focus, and if you kind of gather everything around that, always, every day, all the time, then things fall into place. But there's also this work of sifting and purging the heart's purposes, and they can, what people talk about as the midlife crisis, it is a phenomenon, and I've seen it, around the order that reaching a certain age after a certain achievement, many men find themselves having to sift and purge their heart's purposes all over again, or it seems like that, or going back to the beginning in some way, and as death becomes more real. Death is not real for young people. You know it's going to happen, but you don't really believe it's going to happen to you. Whereas when you reach a certain age, I was thinking of myself more than Scott. It becomes more real, and the limitations of yourself are there. Your infinite possibilities at the age of 28 are suddenly reduced significantly and become finite. So that it's one reason why the same with old age. That people talk about helping the brothers to enter into the good living of old age. Some people are skeptical about that, and think, well, the brothers should be well equipped from their preaching and their previous experience but we know that some people find it very difficult to enter into old age. We did ask, I remember, in a visitation to the province of the Netherlands. The Netherlands now has 7 or 8 brothers in formation, but 7 years ago there was nobody, and it looked like the province might die. There were still about 70 brothers, but I think there were only 2 under the age of 60. So, and I remember, perhaps naively, in the visitation letter, we kind of suggested that the brothers might, help to develop spirituality and theology of aging. But then afterwards, nothing happened. But I was thinking later on, years later, I thought, well, maybe, when you're in your 70s and 80s, the last thing you want to do is to develop a spirituality and theology of aging. You have other things on your mind, like next week's hospital appointment. So, you had a point yesterday about the reasons you stay and the reasons you don't leave. Would you like to
the reasons you join are not the reasons why you stay, and the reasons why you stay are not the reasons why you don't leave. And that seems to be, I mean, it's kind of a joke, but it seems to be like it's becoming a third kind of recommitment to this life. That, as you said so eloquently, like we get to a certain point, we really are settled. We have one option in our life, and that option is very clear, and it seems to unnerve some brothers. And so it's another call to recommit and look at why are we still here?
What would sometimes this age in which we're living is characterized by both anxiety, isolation, and even inflammation. I've seen among the younger brothers a certain patience and their growth in virtue coupled with a perfectionism as well. And I'm wondering what would St. Thomas offer as an anecdote to this kind of reality?
Well, I think his presentation of acquired virtue, virtue as something that's built up, developed, grows, is one thing that's very helpful. pastorally and in spiritual direction and so on, when people are frustrated at their progress or their lack of progress, that there are things that just take time, which is why that sentence is in the RFG about all aspects of formation require time. And I did say that last night. It would be interesting just to know a bit more about how are people experiencing time and space now. You hear lots of voices saying the digital continent, the digital world, it's changing our anthropology, it's changing people's experience of what it means to be a human being. And I mean, how seriously should we take those kind of statements? If it's true, we can see some of the ways in which it's having an impact on the level of public discourse, for example, which has just gone down the toilet in many places. Human relationships, loneliness, the suicide, young people who are, whose lives are over because somebody did something on the internet or they didn't get so many votes of approval. And, is there some new experience of time and space as a result of that continent, that new continent? I don't know. Aquinas does, one piece of advice I've always held on to from Aquinas is that he does say somewhere that God allows us sometimes to fall into certain vices to protect us from falling into worse vices. So, the worst vices are pride and envy. No, for Aquinas, these are the worst sins. The spiritual vices, what he calls spiritual vices. The physical vices are more pedestrian. They're more obvious. They're undeniable. Gluttony or lust or anger sometimes. What else is there? Covetousness. Sloth, yes. But the two really tricky ones are pride and envy. Tricky, they're all tricky, but these ones are tricky in the sense that they're more subtle and insinuate themselves more deeply, like some of these worms that kind of can get inside the human body and do terrible things. So I don't know if that's any help. I've always held on to that myself personally. That maybe my vices are what they are in order to protect me from too much pride and envy. Not completely, but I don't know what.
Quick note, Father Vivian, but this is something that I think Pope Francis talks about in Maris Laetitia as an obstacle to the family, as one of the biggest dangers, which is dissociate. So we talk about instant gratification, but seeing instant gratification in this sense as a lens for dissociating time from opportunities for growth, not seeing that as the same kind of factor, and that family building in the same way as virtue building, it's the same kind of thing. So it seems like there's a connection there.
Thanks for that. That's Amoris Laetitia gets attention because of one footnote, but it takes away, there are two wonderful chapters in Amoris Laetitia about love and about living together, which are in the document addressed to family life, but which are very easily transferable to community life. I think, I don't know, I can't remember which chapters they are, but there are two chapters about, one is a commentary on 1 Corinthians 13, if I remember, and the other is about common life, but they're very valuable for religious life as well.
Thank you, Vivian.
Okay, we leave it for now.